A 2022 gaming laptop with cutting-edge 12th gen Intel CPU and RTX 3000 series GPU should be able to match the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 for quality, resolution and FPS. Even if they can't get a perfect match for console visuals, PC-exclusive tech like deep learning super sampling can give the laptop a leg up without hurting image quality. Plus, you get a whole heap more functionality with a full-fledged Windows laptop than you do with a PS5 or Series X. The thing is, these new laptops cost a lot more than the consoles, and if gaming is your primary use case, they might not seem worth the added premium. So, how about old ones? The PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X have monster GPU performance, on par with an RTX 2080 or 3070. Finding a laptop with one of these on board still costs at least double the price of a console, at least at the time of recording. Laptops like this 2020 Razer Blade 15, however, can be picked up for about £500 to £600 second-hand. As far as a fully equipped gaming PC with RT-enabled graphics, DLSS and a built-in high-refresh display is concerned, this is potentially a very good deal as a portable gaming machine or even as a desktop replacement. Alas, for the purposes of this comparison, it falls a little short of the consoles, at least on paper. The question I have is, does this matter? Can the less expensive laptop overcome its deficit and play console games at console-equivalent settings? And if not, how close does it get? And is it still a playable experience? To find out, I picked a handful of games that have full 9th gen console versions available, and spent some time poring over digital Foundry videos and articles on Eurogamer to establish what their resolutions, frame rates and equivalent quality settings were. Starting off with a few cross-platform titles. As seems to be the norm these days, the console version of Elden Ring has both quality and performance modes, the latter running at a dynamic 4K 60. Quality mode doesn't use dynamic scaling, instead removing the frame rate limit and letting FPS drop as low as needed. Arguably, a 30 FPS cap might have been a good idea here, but DF's benchmarks saw FPS vary from 35 to 45. By duplicating these settings, the laptop failed miserably, not even hitting half the frame rate of the console. The RTX 2060 lacks the horsepower and VRAM to give a strong, consistent experience at 4K. 21 FPS is barely playable at the best of times, and in a game which often relies on reaction times, this can just serve to add to your frustration. Dropping resolution is perhaps the best option. 3200 by 1800 at the same settings lifts averages to a more playable 31 FPS. 1% lows are still pretty inconsistent, which might be the one thing PC gamers remember Elden Ring for, but gameplay is still better than it was at launch, and 1800p would at least allow for playing with a 30 FPS cap to perhaps even things out somewhat. Performance mode has a few settings reduced from quality mode, but the main difference is the resolution, which DF measured varying from as high as full 2160p down as low as 1512p. Trying to run at 1440p with these reduced settings worked surprisingly well, but an average frame rate around 40 FPS is still a long way short of the consoles. Even dropping resolution to 1080 didn't hit the 60 FPS mark. I found it necessary to drop to 810p to get closest to a locked 60 FPS experience on this laptop, but without any kind of temporal reconstruction to help it, this looks soft, even in the 1080p capture footage. Cyberpunk 2077's 9th generation version finally released in early 2022, more than a year after the game was first released. Again, the official PS5 and Xbox Series X versions of the game have two modes. Performance mode targets a locked 60 FPS, and it's mostly successful, though suffers occasional dips into the low 50s and high 40s. To achieve this frame rate, the game runs with a dynamic resolution between 1260p and 1728p on Sony, and between 1382 and 1782 on Microsoft. Quality mode runs at a locked 1440p and a mostly locked 30 FPS. The key difference for gamers is that this mode enables real-time ray tracing, though this feature is limited to local shadows, so no RT reflections or global illumination. It wasn't immediately clear which quality settings were being used by the consoles, so while testing I settled on the high preset. This time round, I feel like the Razer was much more successful. In approaching quality mode, native 1440 at high settings with RT shadows was just 10% short of the mark, averaging about 27 FPS with dips into the high teens. Dropping the quality preset to medium almost meets the target at 29.5 FPS, but rather than take the hit to image quality, I decided instead to try using the RTX 2060's not-so-secret weapon, DLSS. Adding the deep learning assisted upscaler at its quality setting saw averages of 36.6 FPS and lows of 19.6. Given just how good DLSS can look at higher output resolutions, you might find dropping to balanced or performance will still give acceptable quality and improve the 1% lows. Performance mode was, oddly, a harder target to reach. Matching the lower bounds of the console's dynamic resolution saw a frame rate in the high 30s, but getting up to 60 took a far greater hit on image quality. The reason for that was, as FPS approached 60, the CPU actually became a limiting factor. Now, this might not be the case if you can pick up a laptop with an i9 or Ryzen 9, or maybe a laptop that isn't as thermally or power constrained as my Razer Blade. As it is though, I found that while running at a reconstructed 720p using DLSS got me close to 60 FPS on average, it wasn't getting full use out of the RTX 2060. According to Digital Foundry, consoles render Control Ultimate Edition at 1440p in both quality and performance modes. The key differences between the two options are that performance mode targets 60 FPS without ray tracing, while the quality mode targets 30 FPS and adds RT reflections. With the official console equivalent settings dialed in as closely as possible, I had two options for rendering at 1440, either via DLSS or not. Now, that might seem like a no-brainer, but bear in mind, DLSS has its own impact on performance, however small that might be. With DLSS enabled, I measured an average FPS of 28 and minimum of 25. This isn't too far below the 30 FPS target, and disabling DLSS and just running at native 1440 only added about an extra frame, so probably isn't worth the sacrifice in apparent quality. Unfortunately, regardless of DLSS or not, this setup also saw a familiar graphics issue, where assets like textures failed to load throughout the game. The last time I brought this up, I was made aware of a mod that helps fix this issue in some GPUs, however, it didn't seem to work in this case. The capture footage was taken after I added the mod, and it's clearly still an issue. Alas, regardless of RT effects or quality settings, this kinda ruins Control's quality mode for me. When trying to match performance mode, dropping the RT reflections brings an FPS increase once more depending on whether I use DLSS or not. With DLSS it comes in at just under 38 FPS on average, and without DLSS enabled it almost hits 41 FPS. It seems that by disabling RT, the game has enough resources to work with that it can afford to turn some of those assets back up a little, with Jesse and RT looking a little less plastic this time around, but still some way off the next-gen experience. To reach the target 60 FPS frame rate, I had to drop the internal resolution to 1080. Without DLSS, I saw an average of 63 FPS, and with DLSS that drops a fair amount down to under 55. I don't have a proper working 4K capture setup, so I can't adequately compare quality of 1080 versus 4K with DLSS performance, but either way, the highlight for me is that assets are now almost fully loaded. In my opinion, either of these is preferable over attempting to render at high resolutions. Moving on to a couple of titles you won't find on PlayStation. Forza Horizon 5's quality mode runs at a fixed 4K 30 FPS on Series X. Loading up console equivalent settings at 4K, the laptop comes surprisingly close, but just fails to reach a 30 FPS average in the canned benchmark. Adding FSR Ultra quality takes the effective render resolution down to 1660p, but that is just enough to push the average over the 30 FPS mark without harming quality too much, and dropping to an even lower setting could help achieve a locked 30 FPS. If I were an Xbox owner, however, performance mode would be my personal preference, running at 60 FPS with dynamic resolution between 1600p and full 4K with reduced settings. DRS is missing from the PC port, so I tested a variety of resolutions to see if I could get any of them to hit the target. From a 4K output image, adding FSR Ultra quality is close to the 1600p minimum of the Xbox version, and that still only manages 44 FPS. Of course, as with DLSS, FSR scaling isn't completely free, it has its own impact on performance. The closest resolution I could get using nVidia DSR was 1577p, which managed just over 50 FPS with minimums of 45. That being said, there is still plenty of performance left on the table. The CPU isn't holding things back, and dropping to FSR performance for a render resolution of 1080 gets within spitting distance of the 60 FPS target. Halo Infinite has a definite preference for AMD's RDNA 2 graphics, and doesn't perform too well on older architectures. Thankfully, the RTX 2060 falls into the sweet spot of being just new enough that 343 actually optimised the game for it, and it can actually perform pretty well. The console version once more has a choice of quality and performance modes. The former is a locked 30 FPS using high quality settings and a dynamic 2160p resolution. The game actually features DRS in the PC version, so I used it with both minimum and maximum FPS set to 30, and at least from a performance perspective, it did a reasonable job. There were a few dips in my benchmark run, which is to be expected as exterior open world sections can be very demanding. What really dipped was image quality. The game was struggling to construct a cohesive image, with assets like textures, trees and rocks dropping in level of detail. For this reason, my attempts to replicate performance mode actually, in my opinion, looked better. With the target set to dynamic 1440p and 60 FPS, asset quality remained much higher despite the lower settings. The downside was that the PC didn't quite manage to hold the frame times as close as it did at 30 FPS. Whether this was down to the CPU, I'm not sure, but 1% lows were frequently below 30 FPS, bringing the average down to just 53. Moving on now to some older PlayStation exclusives. God of War was originally a PS4 title, but received a 9th gen patch earlier this year. The patch doesn't increase the image quality settings above the PS4 version, but instead locks the game to a full 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, with the occasional stutter reported in more intensive scenes. This is pretty tough for our poor laptop to match. In fact, trying to do so results in a distinctly last-gen experience, averaging just over 30 FPS, with dips into the high 20s in gameplay and even lower during cutscenes. God of War is still demonstrably playable at 30 FPS. As I just pointed out, this is how the PS4 Pro used to run the game, but thanks to DLSS, it's still possible to recover some more lost frames. DLSS performance is a big drop in render resolution to about 1080p, but if you're playing on a TV, you might never see the difference. What you will notice is the extra FPS. Averages now come close to the magic 60, with lows of about 50 during gameplay. Out of curiosity, I also tested FSR2, a hardware-agnostic upscaler from AMD that was added to God of War a few weeks ago. DLSS beats FSR2 by a barely perceptible 4 to 5%, but that's fairly irrelevant in this test. Still, if you have an even older laptop with, say, GTX 1080 graphics, this might come in handy. And the story is pretty much the same with the other former PlayStation exclusive tested today, Horizon Zero Dawn. This time the PS5 uses checkerboard rendering to achieve a 4K-ish image at a stable 60 FPS. That checkerboarding option isn't available on PC, and attempting to run at 4K native sees FPS fail to hit even 30 FPS on average. I didn't find this particularly playable. In fact, gameplay felt positively sluggish at these frame rates. However, thankfully the game now supports DLSS. Adding DLSS performance to a 4K image drops the render resolution to 1080p, but almost doubles the frame rate. Averages jumped from 28 FPS to 48 FPS, and lows from 24 to 41. This, of course, is still a fair way short of the 60 FPS target. As there isn't a DLSS Ultra performance setting, this meant I had to drop the output resolution to 1440p and the render resolution to just 720p. This is going to have a noticeable impact on quality for many people, but it does at least achieve the 60 FPS target, with an average of 63 and 1% lows of 51. So I spent a few hours attempting to benchmark Guardians of the Galaxy, but couldn't get consistent results that made any sense. This kind of sums up my experience with this game of late, and I think this might be the final straw for me. Future GPU reviews are probably going to see a different title replacing this game. Not that there's anything wrong with it, I still actually quite like it, but I can't rely on the built-in benchmark to give results that relate to actual gameplay, and actual gameplay varies in performance wildly from one level to another. Even in titles that don't make me pull my hair out, pushing a laptop RTX 2060 to match the quality of 9th gen consoles is asking a lot. You have to make a lot of compromises, mainly to resolution, in order to maintain overall image quality without killing your FPS, and in some cases, that can be a step too far. When it's available, DLSS goes a long way to making up for this shortfall without making images look soft or pixelated, but it's not a magic toggle that fixes everything. In short, these laptops just aren't quite up to the task at hand, and for the time being, fighting consoles on a level playing field means either spending more money on a more powerful laptop or buying a desktop. Of course, that doesn't mean these cheaper laptops don't have their own merits. Click the video on the left to see the Razer Blade 15 tested at more appropriate settings, or the video on the right to see whether it can actually make proper use of that 144Hz screen. Kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.